Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 170. Thank you for joining us. Today, Bonnie and I are joined by Kolbe teachers Kim Crawford, Amanda Hayes, and Beth Dobrozsi to discuss writing. For many students and parents, the process of writing can be intimidating. Our guests advise us on what are reasonable expectations, some of the pitfalls in the writing process, and how we can guide our students to success. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
Stephen, what's a good word?
I forgot that you were going to ask that today.
Okay, want me to do something else? I can do something else.
It's the fractions of a seconds before you asked. Anticipation came up because I was like, oh, I forgot to anticipate this, and now I'm anticipating a question that I don't have a good answer for. But anticipation is the word that we'll see whether it applies to today's or guests and their wisdom or not, I guess.
Well, I have been anticipating this conversation with great eagerness for quite a while, and we have lots of anticipation about the start of the school year, which is when this episode will be coming out as things are getting going with the new school year. So here from Kolbe's English and Literature Department, we have Mrs. Kim Crawford, Mrs. Beth Dobrozsi, and Mrs. Amanda Hayes. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see you all. How are you?
Doing well. Doing great. It's nice to be back and chatting with not only my favorite podcaster, but now mother of one of my favorite former students. So There you go.
Very sweet. That was so fabulous to get to meet you in person in Atlanta and for commencement and just get to spend that time with you. And I just ran across a picture that you took of the two of you together, of my son with you at the reception. I was like, oh, just happy memories of the time. That was so fun. And he has such fondness for you. And he found out that you're teaching the 9th grade Greek literature, in which my daughter's enrolled. He was like, what? I'd go back and take that with her. Like,
oh man, I love having siblings. I am so excited to have her in class.
Yes, she's looking forward to it as well. Mrs. Hayes, how are you doing? It's been a while. You were with us for an episode about middle school. It was somewhere in the episode number 60-ish, somewhere in there. I'll put it in the show notes. That was a good episode. It's good to see you. I'm glad you're back. You're overdue for coming back to talk to us.
Yes. Yeah. It's good to be back and talk more about Kolbe stuff.
Good. Mrs. Dubrosi, I'm very happy to meet you today. I have been looking forward to getting to know you a bit. Would you tell us a bit about yourself and your family and your background and your Kolbe connection?
Thank you for inviting me.
Sure.
It's been many years, we'll just say many years, that I've been connected with Kolbe in some capacity, but it started when my husband and I were homeschooling our 4 children. And I guess all but the last 2 graduated with Kolbe diplomas. And the oldest now is a priest in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and the youngest is here at Hillsdale College, where my husband teaches in chemistry. I got involved with teaching in co-ops and teaching in classical academies. It kind of all started when I you're teaching your own children, especially writing. And foreign language can fall by the wayside. So for accountability, I'd invite other kids over, and then you can't skip it, right? Because, oh, look, they're at the front door.
Okay.
So I got into homeschool co-ops first, and then ultimately teaching in classical academies, and then several years ago with Kolbe Academy online. So.
And what sorts of courses do you teach now for Kolbe?
I teach English, which includes grammar and composition, and I teach literature, 8th grade. I love it. I love middle school.
Okay, well, that is good to hear. That is, we had that conversation that I had with Mrs. Hayes a couple of years ago that I mentioned earlier. That was a really good conversation about middle school, and I've been hoping to follow up a bit. What is it about middle school that appeals to you so much?
Especially Kolbe families, they haven't lost their innocence and enthusiasm and eagerness, and the families are living beautiful Catholic lives. I love big families. I love the chaos that comes with families. And middle school is, especially 8th grade, you know, they know that high school is coming and they're anxious for it. And it's a great year of preparation. 7th grade, wow, what a goofy year. And there's a lot of silliness in 7th graders that for some reason over the summer between 7th and 8th grade evaporates. And 6th graders are, you know, they're eager to be grown up. 5th graders, I did teach 5th grade one year, and they were still kind of climbing the walls a little bit there.
Yeah.
So I just kind of landed. I have taught 9th and 10th and even up through 11th and 12th in literature. My favorite is just those bright-eyed middle schoolers.
Okay. That is a lovely perspective. I've got a rising 8th grader this year. Well, by the time this episode comes out, she'll be an official 8th grader. So I love hearing that from those with whom they interact so frequently. So, okay. So our topic today is writing, which folks might have guessed from either the title of the episode or the how we've already gotten started here. We want to give some writing tips to students and parents at the outset of this school year. So to set the scene for that, Mrs. Crawford, as the chair of the English and Literature Department, would you please talk to us a bit about the role that writing plays in Kolbe courses? Kolbe is known for having a lot of writing, but would you take it away? Tell us more about that.
Happy to. So writing is foundational in all our courses, and we start early. In K through 2, we have a heavy emphasis on the mechanics of writing, you know, forming the letters, the penmanship, sentence forms, you know, just getting their sweet little thoughts down on paper and then, you know, shaping it somewhat grammatically. But in 3rd grade, we really launch into the ideas of ordering the ideas and writing paragraphs, which, you know, from there will come papers and, you know, works of great monumental import. And so 3rd grade is really where the shift happens in our elementary curriculum. And it's a great writing growth year. And we actually will be having writing labs. We started with the beginning writing lab for 9th graders and intermediate writing lab for 10th graders last year, although, you know, any high schoolers can join them. They don't have to be that grade specific. But new this year, we're adding writing labs for grades 3rd through 8th. And that speaks to that 3rd grade year being a pivotal year for writing and just an explosion of growth within it. And I mentioned that writing is foundational to all our courses. We don't just write in English class. We write in literature class, we write in history class and theology, and science does not escape either. And I would not be surprised if Mrs. Powers in math sneaks writing in there sometimes. And it goes along with the whole person, right? Because not only do you need to think well, and we really emphasize critical thinking here at Kolbe, but you need to be able to communicate it. It's great to have all those thoughts floating around in your head, but you've got to be able to get them down and out. So that way, you know, you can share the gift of your thought with everybody. And writing is one of the best ways to do that. Speaking is great, but writing can be easily disseminated. Although I guess so can oral things too in this technological day and age. But writing is just where it happens. So many folks find that, oh, I get flustered when I speak, but give me a pen and I can get down all my thoughts. And so we're here to help you do that well and do it to, you know, a high degree of execution.
Yeah, lots of practice at it. So it becomes, where it might seem at the outset like, oh, there's so much writing, but And speaking, we were talking about my eldest, who is a Kolbe class of 2023 graduate. Oh, I've got a paper to write. Okay. And definitely the amount of practice he got writing papers throughout his time at Kolbe, he certainly feels well equipped for the next chapter, and the prospect of writing a paper is not so daunting to him. And for a lot of folks, I think it is like just a blank page. That's very daunting, like I said, and just kind of, so that's kind of that's part of what we're hoping to address today. And so let's start with that blank page, like I said, for a student who's approaching a writing assignment. How do y'all like to encourage that early phase?
One thing I always tell my students is that you can always edit bad writing. You cannot edit non-existent writing, non-existent writing. And so the goal at first is to just get something down on the page. Don't aim for perfection. You get a lot of, in middle school especially, a lot of students can be very perfectionistic, especially if they are firstborns, or if they just have more of a type A personality. They can just freeze. Well, and actually one thing I found is that my ADD students, the students who have ADHD, often have a large amount of perfectionist tendencies, but with the ADHD aspect of it, they will freeze. And if they can't do it perfectly, they won't do it at all. And the reality is, I tell them, I'm like, all professional writers edit extensively. And so the reality is your first draft does not need to be perfect. It doesn't even need to be good. It can be terrible. But I was like, that's fine. Get something on the paper. We can fix bad writing, but I can't fix a blank page. So you have to get something down. And yeah.
Okay. And the prompts that are given for the Kolbe writing assignments, so they're very specific, and along with them come rubrics, like here's what we're looking for this. So I think those are two good supports too, to help with those. What do you think, Mrs. Dubrosi, about starting a writing assignment? What do you usually tell your students?
I'll divide my answer into creative writing.
Okay.
The truly blank page, the deer in the headlight.
Yeah.
And then the writing prompt, because they write in all subjects. Sometimes they can't get going because they can't think of what to write and how to organize it. So with the creative writing, and actually both, once you get into that, like the essay question prompt, it's to train them to barrage their brain with questions. And so you can just train them to ask themselves the who, what, where, when, what kind, and then to just jot down those little ideas. I also tell parents, don't be afraid to do that part with, especially middle schoolers and young high schoolers, because that can just get ideas flowing. We'll often do that in class, and then put the ideas up on the board. But when you're faced with an essay prompt, especially on a test, it's just kind of you, right, in the paper, to barrage your brain with questions. But before that, the clue is in the question prompt, really. So I actually work with students. They just, and I totally agree with what was just said about the perfectionist. That first sentence, there's just this, they just want that. It's like to get that first sentence right is to train them how to come up with the topic sentence from the question. So if I'm in literature and it says describe the character of Frodo in Fellowship of the Ring, then the clue is in the question, and to turn that into the topic sentence. So if the directions say one paragraph, then the topic sentence is Frodo is such and such character, right? And then you focus on that topic in the paragraph. And so in middle school, especially, to just train them to, now let's get that topic sentence in. And then of course, the ideas that you train your brain to ask yourself then can flow from there.
That's a good tip.
For You mentioned that Kolbe writing prompts are very specific, and they often are. And, sometimes it's write a paper on this. And sometimes I try to give my students a choice of a few. And that is to give them choice and to give them some agency in, oh man, I am not writing about that. Oh, but maybe I'll write about this. And so seeing what you have an affinity for in a prompt, that's with, a prompted paper. With a truly blank page, just brainstorming and giving yourself the freedom to let your mind wander. I get lots of questions about the college essay since I teach mostly seniors and have the homeroom 12 class. And we talk about the college essay, and which is, always a very nebulous prompt. Tell us about an important time in your life. Tell us about something that blah, blah, blah. Just something very vague that you could go either bonkers with or just sit there and freeze, as Mrs. Hayes was saying. And that I just like creating, just really letting your mind wander and creating just a weird list. And, okay, frogs, monkeys, the zoo. No, not the zoo, the library. Okay, popsicles. And just kind of having free association. And you'll eventually hit on something. It does take a little time. But speaking of time, getting from the start and what do I do with this blank page or this prompt that maybe I don't want to write, and then getting it to completion. And that is time. Give yourself time. Do not be starting that paper the night before. I know that we're all guilty of it. It's possible that, even older people, maybe people who are 47, do things the night before. I don't know any 47-year-olds who do that.
No,
but giving yourself time to let those ideas marinate, to create a rough draft, because again, as Mrs. Hayes was saying, can't fix air, can't fix, nothing, but giving yourself a rough draft, then letting it sit. And then you can come back to it with fresh eyes and say, oh gosh, I wrote that. That's terrible, but I know how to fix it.
Good. Do you guys find ever that sometimes it helps to skip that topic sentence and just go right for what you want to mainly say, and then you can come back and craft a topic sentence? If that is the holdup, like I know what I want to say, but not how I want to start.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's easier to start with the body paragraphs because you're like, oh, I want to say this and this and this, and here's that quote, and this is why it's important. And so sometimes it's easier to start in the middle. And then you can always go back and say, okay, this is what I said. Let me shape it into, introducing it.
Right. And nowadays, since you're typing your essays most of the time, it's really easy to copy and paste and move sentences around. So if you just sort of get your ideas out there, and as Mrs. Crawford said, start in the middle, start whatever idea comes up in your head, you can always move things around later. And so that makes it a lot easier than, back in the day, in the dark ages, when, those of us who were forced to handwrite papers were handwriting. Nowadays, it's really easy to move things around within a document.
I was just thinking about a paper I wrote by hand in high school, and it was about chocolate, happily enough. But yeah, it was handwritten, so I was in it from the get-go. Yeah.
I still have a lot of homeschooling families still like the handwritten approach. And in middle school, I'll have students ask if they can submit things that way. And if that's the preference, absolutely for the parents and the child, then have at it. I have a couple suggestions with that, though, that I think are handy. And one, even with typewritten papers, is to separate the composition task from the proofreading editing task, because actually different parts of the brain totally are involved with those tasks. So in terms of stream of thought, just the train of thinking, to not interrupt that creative process, to just don't worry about the proofreading, editing, the spelling. And not everybody is, even if they read well, necessarily is a gifted speller. So just separate those tasks and come back to the proofreading and editing later. And then if handwriting, if that's the preference, then I actually encourage certainly double spacing, because that helps with the rearranging later, but to use pen instead of pencil, because the physicality of a pencil is that it bugs some people to have that get dull, and then that interrupts the train of thought, right, to go sharpen the pencil, or even in a mechanical pencil instead of an ordinary pencil. But a pen is just smooth, right? And then guess what? Instead of erasing and interrupting the brain, just cross it out and you write it above it. And to introduce that kind of writer to when they get to the editing phase to basic proof marks. But all of those things kind of can help with just the creative process, and once their juices start flowing, to keep it going.
Mrs. Dubrosi, I think that's such an interesting thing that you brought up, the physicality of writing, because we think of it as such a mental process, and even such an easy automated process with typewriting, but there is that mind-body connection with routing it through the hand to get to the brain. That's really important. And then also things that can trip us up with a scritchy pencil or a dull pencil, or my pen is nice and smooth, but darn it, it ran out of ink, and the things that can trip us up. And it makes me think about how far we've come to all these medieval scribes hunched over their scriptorium items and drawing in the margins to, here we sit at desks, and it's kind of the same, but very different. And especially when you throw in typing. And I really liked that you talked about the physicality as well as the mental process.
That made a lot of sense to me, because when I take my notebook and my pen, go sit down in a chair and I'm writing, I'm just focused on writing, and there's more of a quiet atmosphere for me. I kind of like the process, but then as you were talking about that, when I'm sitting at my computer, I'm constantly seeing my mistypings, and I'm going back, and it's, underlined them in red already, and I can't handle it. So I have to go back and change that. And then my mind has it's broken, like you were saying. So that's really good. I hadn't thought about that before, but I do kind of like that. I have enjoyed the process over the last year, especially of going and writing my first draft in pen on a pad of paper, and then whether I actually type it in word for word or just come back and redo it in an electronic format that was my first draft. Now I'm just going to reorder it and do it again. It seems to be helpful when I can do that, but that could be why I'm not distracted every single second with alert, misspelling, right. Doing all these things that I'm going on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I would add one more thing, kind of empowering parents, is that, and Mrs. Hayes was talking about that perfectionist writer. You can just know that I don't know how to spell this word, or this word doesn't look right. And to even on the computer to look it up or get a dictionary takes even more time. I always encourage parents, be your child's walking dictionary, but spell it out loud. Don't just show it to them or do it for them. Spell it out loud, letter by letter. That's the other thing that makes great spellers. In the old days, even before my time, spelling bees were common. And again, brain research shows that spelling a word out loud, so that you don't just see the word, but your brain hears the word. Many learners are auditory. So to spell that word out loud, letter by letter, helps to imprint it. The frustration of knowing that your kid misspells this all the time, right? And why aren't they getting it? So another thing that, just not to interrupt that creative process, right? We're not in the proofing, we're not in the editing stage. Just be your kid's walking dictionary.
How about for homeschooling parents who are teaching writing as a homeschool course themselves and evaluating student work? What words of wisdom do you have for them?
So to carry on from something that Mrs. Dubrosi had said, it's helpful as a parent to remember that writing is difficult and that writing is made up of many different parts. One part is the physical act of writing, and especially nowadays where a lot of us, I was going to say a lot of kids, but let's be honest, a lot of us are typing rather than handwriting. Your hand can physically get tired, especially your young child's hand, your elementary student's hand can physically get tired writing. And this is where I joke that my boys have pencil allergies. As soon as you ask them to pick up a pencil and actually write something, there's much gnashing of teeth and wailing and laying on the chair and I can't do it.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that's helpful is to remember that each part of writing is difficult, but each part of writing is a different task. So there's the physical act of writing, whether that be handwriting or typing. There's the ideas, the fact that writing is thinking, and that's why it's difficult, because thinking is difficult. And so thinking up ideas is a separate task from writing them down. And then there's the organizing your ideas, communicating them clearly and effectively to your reader in a way that makes sense to another person. And then there's the last part would be the conventions, the spelling, the grammar, things like that, which we focus a lot of time on because there's a lot of nuance and detail there that needs to be remembered. But the reality is that's kind of the last and least important part of it. But it is critical to communicating effectively to others. It's, I talk about to my students that it's an act of charity to your reader to spell correctly and use correct grammar, because it helps them understand what you're saying. It's a form of politeness and it's a form of communicating effectively to other people. But so as a parent, it can be helpful if you identify that there's one part of that process that your student is getting really stuck on. It can help to break those apart. So if your student seems to have great ideas, you can tell they understand the topic when they speak to you, but when they write, it kind of comes across as gibberish. It can be helpful to have them speak to you and you have them dictate to you and you write down what they say for a little bit or type what they say to get them started. If your child has a significant problem with physically writing, then maybe typing is better. Or maybe if they are easily distracted by being on the computer, maybe, as Mr. Hayden had said, giving them a pad of paper and a quiet room with fewer distractions would be a better choice. And so, and same thing, if they struggle with grammar and spelling, take that aspect out of getting their ideas on paper, give them a pad of paper without a computer, underlining every error that they make so they're not distracted by that, and just get them to write, and then they can go back and edit. So that can be one helpful tip, is to remember that it's hard. Remember that writing is made up of many different parts. And if your student is struggling with one part, you can separate that part out from the others so that they can get their ideas down. And so you can work on each aspect of writing individually.
Parents at home can sometimes struggle with how to judge or evaluate the writing. And students, for their part, can be feel like it's a mysterious process, and feel like the evaluation of it is subjective. And then, of course, you asked about middle school. Why do I like to teach middle school? Well, that is the classic pushback, right? And you don't want to get into an argument all the time with your children. Kolbe Online, we use a lot of rubrics, but that's really just you can do this at home without calling it a rubric and just call it a checklist. And I think especially with struggling writers, now some folks are just gifted at writing and the words flow like a river, and you're like, oh gosh, I didn't say 8 pages, I said 8 sentences. But for those who are struggling, just a checklist. I mean, what are they struggling with? And I have taught many years through the Institute for Excellence in Writing, and there it may be coined, I don't know, or But they call it easy +1. You know what your child is struggling with. So, the checklist might be the 4 or 5 things that they've mastered, and put those on the checklist because you want to see those. And then the thing that you're trying to get them to do is the +1, right? And then there's your checklist. And the last thing that I always put in was what Mrs. Hayes referred to as, it's polite to have it edited and corrected. So that's the last thing on the checklist that they get to after the creative process of writing. But then the child knows what you're looking for, right? And especially boys, they love the checklist. They love the checklist. I did this, I did this, I did this, and you can make that as long a checklist, maybe a longer checklist for gifted writers, but a shorter checklist that's manageable, that doesn't look nightmarish for the struggling writer. And then they master that +1 thing, and then, okay, now that just becomes part of the checklist, and we add, what's the next thing you want them to do? And by the end of the year, you and the student will be like, look at this, look what we've accomplished. We went from here and now we're here.
I really like that idea of the checklist, Mrs. Dubrosi. Part of it, it takes away some of that subjectivity and, oh, you just don't like that. And it makes it more objective. And then also along with that objectivity, it takes away the potential for feeling personally attacked, because
Right.
writing can be very personal, right? Like, Mars is a planet. That's a fact. There's no feelings involved there, right? You didn't create that fact. But when you create writing and you're struggling with it, or you don't feel like you're doing well, it can be very emotional. And so having a checklist really takes some of that emotion away, and some of that, oh, my mom doesn't like the way I write. And speaking of, to the other part of that, is that your child may have a different writing style from you. And, perhaps you think paper should sound this way, but your child sounds this way. And that's okay, that, your child is a distinct person from you. It's okay. So there, it's good to have that checklist for, was the argument made? Did they spell things correctly, and take away that, oh, well, this isn't how I would write, or, oh, and then of course our personal feelings toward our children, like, oh, I can't believe my child is writing like this. I wouldn't do this at all. And I feel like it takes away a lot of the emotional potential for negative emotional feelings when it's more objective, and for both parent and child.
I found it difficult I don't teach a lot of writing to my children. Fortunately, my wife takes care of that in our homeschooling situation. But I could see as a parent, especially if you're jumping into this new from, you haven't watched your child come up through the different grades, but maybe you're jumping in 6th grade or wherever, to kind of figure out yourself what the writing experience is like at that age. Even I remember just after my wife and I were married, we're spending time at my family's house, and we had all of these papers that had been saved from like 6th grade on, and we were, graduated from college here, and just seeing what I thought were great papers, at the different, it's like, well, that's not doing the same thing that this later paper is. They're a different sort of, there's a progression, which of course there's a progression, but I wasn't thinking of that being a recent college graduate. And it's just like, no, all the time I would have been writing, very logically. And it's just so I think that would be even harder if you haven't done it yourself from the beginning, but you have to jump in and try to figure out where do things stand,
Yeah. I find it difficult to know sometimes. Is this sort of, I don't want to use the word like on level or anything like that, but for this child at where they are in this course, or just where they are anyway, with all the caveats. Okay, move on, Bonnie. Like, I have a hard time knowing, is this an appropriate response for this child for this piece of work? Could they do more? Am I asking too much? are my expectations too high or too low? It's hard for me to kind of know all of that. So, yeah.
With that question, because I think that's a really common question, and it can be a little haunting to parents. I remember when I homeschooled and when I didn't teach others, you can sometimes have a lack of confidence. And I would put composition in a category like swimming or like sports then, which is that here we are, and this is what their skill level is at the beginning of the year, and try to not get distracted maybe by how are they measuring up against others. But here we are with this student, because the beauty of homeschooling, right, is individualized approach. Is here we are at the beginning of the year, and this is what they're capable of, and then approaching it like swimming, and at the end of the year we made this much progress. Now my oldest, who's now a priest and actually, believe it or not, in college, trained and was a lifeguard. This was the kid that actually with swimming looked like he was drowning at every moment.
Oh no.
He get to the other side of the pool and act like he was an Olympic swimmer. You'd be like, yeah, it's great, honey. So, sometimes with some skills, you just have to measure the progress, especially with struggling writers. And I loved what Mrs. Crawford was talking about, them finding their voice, right? Especially young writers, even middle school and early high schoolers, they haven't found their voice yet. And sometimes when they put something together, it can sound incredibly awkward or stilted or not the way we would write. And it's an exercise in patience. I would just love people who would come up to me and say, oh, you homeschool, you must be incredibly patient. And I had to train my children not to roll their eyes. So it's the virtue I'm working on. I'm still not there. So, sometimes we just have to, in fact, I think with, as teachers, we have to give a letter grade, but there's always a gauge in there, of where that person is really at when they come into the school year with a skill level. And the idea is that they make progress. Certainly, as parents, we have to fight sloth and laziness and those sorts of things. But sometimes it's just, this is not the subject that I feel gifted in. And so it's instilling confidence and celebrating the progress.
That's helpful to hear that, all of that. Are there other tips that you want to leave with us as for parents, students?
So I have a couple of tips, and I kind of codified them at the end of intermediate writing lab. We talked about all these writing methods throughout the year and strategies, and be sure to think about this for your introduction. And then I boiled it down to our last class, and I called it Mrs. Crawford's Crazies. And I had a picture that you drive me nuts with a squirrel driving a nut truck, but I still love you. And so for me, like, the thing that drives me nuts is in conclusion. I never, ever, 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 ever want to see that in a paper. And just, that drives me crazy. That's a little, personal to me. I think probably my most practical tip is get it together with your commas. Because if you have too few commas in a sentence, then it's hard to understand. And if you have too many commas in a sentence, that also makes it hard to understand. And so just learn how to use commas. And if you're feeling fancy, their friend the apostrophe too, because those little curly things that go above or below the line, please. I really almost sometimes carry a Sharpie with me and fix them out in the wild when I see them. I've only done that once. I just had to fix it. I've only done it once, but I want to do it many more times than that.
I feel you there. Yep. I'm the same way about commas. Like if we get too many going, let's hold on here. Yeah. Let's just look at our comma situation and reevaluate. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to tell my students, I'm like, okay, the commas, they're not there for decoration. They're not like, you don't just like sprinkle them at random. Like, they mean something.
Yes. More commas, they're lifting more than they should a lot of the time. They're doing the work of other punctuation marks a lot of the time. Like, hold on. Okay.
Yes.
Unfortunately, there are people like me who, when I speak, I constantly qualify things. And so when that bleeds into my writing, those commas just start showing up. It's like, maybe I should have broken that up into multiple sentences. I think I probably could have done that, but
You're a verbal Faulkner, Mr. Hayden.
Yeah, I was supposed to say, I am similarly afflicted with that. Maybe we would make good Russian authors. Yeah, half the page is one sentence.
Right.
Don't ever try to read a Russian author out loud. It doesn't work. You will run out of breath and die. Yeah. I think the biggest tip that I would have, speaking from a middle school perspective, because I teach mostly middle schoolers, the thing that I notice most is that I can't, as a teacher, fix. Like as a writing teacher, there's only so much I can do in the time that I have. But one of the things that I can't fix is if a student doesn't read very often. So if they don't read for fun and they don't have an extensive vocabulary and an extensive exposure to different writing styles and good writing, I can't fix that in a couple hours a week, together. So I think one of the biggest tips that I have for parents is to leave space for reading in your day-to-day life. I mean, we have lots of distractions. My kids play video games too. My kids get distracted with watching TV and stuff. But if you can try to carve out certain times of the day where there aren't other things around, and give your kids plenty of access to good books and the space in which to read them. Set an early bedtime for them, but let them read with a flashlight. Give them a little nightlight, whatever it is. Or have one of my friends has tech-free weeks, so they'll do a 1 week fast from tech. And so because just reading lots, just read, the more the kids read, the better the vocabulary is going to be, the more and then as they get to be a very good reader, then you can sort of start pushing them towards more quality literature and more challenging things. But to start with, as they're reading, that's gonna help tremendously with their writing, because it's going to give them more ideas and more background knowledge to draw from, so they have more things to think of. And it's also going to familiarize them without any explicit instruction. It'll familiarize them with how sentences work, how sentences usually are structured, how commas are usually used, and all of that. And so, so for students, read for fun, read what you enjoy. And for parents, just, I think our role as parents is to provide space for our children to read.
I hadn't really thought of that until recently. I was talking to a teacher who was talking about teaching academic writing for like an upper level high school class. And he was saying, which is obvious, but I hadn't thought of it before, that part of the problem for teaching that is children or students at that age haven't been exposed to academic writing, even if they have read a lot. So he was saying one of the things that he does is he tries to give them good examples of what does a good academic paper or essay look like, so that they could start to model that. And it was, when he said it, I kind of almost slapped my forehead, because it's like, of course, how can you write something when you've never seen an example of it before, or good examples of it before? But that makes perfect sense as well. Then as you're going along, the more you read, the more you have these good examples of what good writing looks like, not just making it up on your own or only bad examples.
Yeah.
I have a tip that as a teacher or as a parent, sometimes you can look at what was written. Here, Mom, I did this, and you're like, did you read this? Your first reaction is, wow. And you know what? All the way up through, I would say, even early teens. Sometimes as adults, we think, we'll say, did you edit this? Did you, self-editing, it's a learned skill. Not everyone knows how to do it. And so we kind of have to remember that sometimes what we're asking is not intuitive. So that helps us deal with our personal frustration. So how can we teach them how to edit their own work? And so since now typing is so common, I actually, it gets into how the brain works, is to not edit on the screen. Now, it depends on your level of skill. I think I can do that pretty proficiently, but I don't think that even middle schooler, certainly not middle schoolers and high schoolers, can necessarily do that well. This is what happens in the brain, is that when you're typing, it's a fast process for many students who are tech savvy. The brain knows what it intended to write. And if they edit it on the screen, the brain literally blips over what is not physically there. So I tell students, slow it down. Even if no one is in the room, read it out loud. Then you'll catch some of your own mistakes. And then even better, print it out. You can read it to the wall, you can read it to the dog. But in middle school, I actually have them at the beginning of the year read something they've written to the class, and they get there on camera and you can see them go, oh, wait, then they realize that words are missing or punctuation is missing, or tagging along with Mrs. Crawford. My thing these days is random capitalization. I'm like, really?
Oh.
I mean, why are we just in the middle of the sentence capitalizing this? I have no idea. So anyway, that's helpful, I think, to train them to do that. And you can just, without a lot of emotion, and just say, hey, would you read this to me? And they'll catch it themselves. A lot of it anyway, and clean it up.
That's a really good idea. I hadn't realized how bad I am with those things until I was recording some introductions to our Kolbecast, and I would have like a little bit of notes written out. And, you're using something like GarageBand or just any recording device, and you start reading it and you think, that sounds horrible. I need to go back and change that. And I mean, that sentence is, I can't even say that sentence because it's so long and I'm gasping for breath by the end of the sentence, or, so that, I think that would be a great advice, just with any of these electronic devices, you can just hit record and read it out loud and see how it goes. And when it doesn't read well, go back and, make a note there that need to adjust that, need to change that sentence, need to add punctuation there, need to do things. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, that's very revealing to hear something you've read out loud and go, oh, that's not how yeah. Okay, well, let's talk for a few minutes about the supports that Kolbe Academy offers for writing students. The writing labs were mentioned. Could we talk a bit more about those? Those are fairly within the past couple of years that they've been introduced. And Mrs. Crawford, you were talking about the high school writing labs, beginning and intermediate labs, and now they're onto the lower grades. How do they pair up with the English courses that the students might be enrolled in? How does that all work?
Absolutely. We started with the writing labs in high school last year, so it is a brand new program. And beginning writing lab goes with English 1 or English 9, as it used to be called, and it's, beginning composition. And then intermediate writing lab pairs with English 2 or English 10. And it's just a little bit more, we go a little bit deeper. And, writing is a spiraled art, right? Like in third grade, you're going to have that paragraph. And in 12th grade, you're still writing paragraphs. So it's a matter of nuance and style and really just digging in and improving it to where you're happy with it, or at least not completely embarrassed by it. And so those writing labs they're just extra practice to kind of, and they go a little slower. Each class focuses, very intensely on one topic. And then we have lots of time to practice, and students can bring in what they're writing for any class, literature or history, and say, please look at any of this, but we're talking about introductions today. Can you look at my introduction? How is this? And so it's a time for working intensively on all the writing things, and there's a focus for the day, but then we can also work on projects that the student has going on. And so that started last year with 9th and 10th graders. Although in my intermediate writing lab, I did have a junior and a senior who, just wanted some brush up. And that was totally great. This year, we're starting writing labs for 3rd grade through 8th grade, and it'll be more of that. It'll have a focused class on, X topic, and then it'll have time to write. And, these are being kind of made from whole cloth, and a lot of it will be teacher discretion. Mrs. Dubrosi will have writing lab 8, and Mrs. Hayes, I believe you'll have writing lab 6 or 7.
Yes, I've got 6.
Okay. And so we're relying on the expertise of the teachers to kind of guide and shape the class, and have, all right, guys, today we're talking about commas, but then also give the time to the students to practice and to craft.
Great. That sounds ideal. And so they don't replace, but they go with the
Yes, they
okay.
do not replace, they go with.
Okay. And there are an array of services offered in the area of tutoring and coaching, both by teachers and NHS students. Our Kolbe's chapter of National Honor Society offers peer tutoring in a variety of academic subjects. And on episode 164, which we entitled "This is Not a Kolbe Infomercial," the mom, Lindsay, talked about sending her students to the tutoring time to have them review the papers that her own students were writing. Now Kolbe is also offering tutoring by teachers as a separate program. And I'll put a link in the show notes to the episode that discusses that a little bit. So there are a couple of routes that families can go seeking out additional individualized support for writing. So do you want to talk more about any of the writing tutoring by the teachers there, or good on that?
Well, we also have kind of in between the writing labs and the tutoring, we have the resource labs. So the resource labs are new. We piloted them with just a few students last year, just to sort of, dip our toes in. So whereas the writing labs are for, any student who just could use a little more help or a little more practice with writing to supplement their ordinary class. The resource labs are more intensive, and they're for students who are really struggling with writing. They may have a learning disability, or they may just really be struggling with writing. Or maybe, especially with the pandemic, we have plenty of students who had gaps in education there, where their public school or their Catholic school shut down, but then like their parents were both working and couldn't fully homeschool. And so there were a couple lost years, so you have some students who missed some stuff. So we have the resource labs where they are more intensive, where I'm doing the writing resource lab for grades 6 through 8. And so basically we will take what projects the students are currently working on in their classes, and we will actually work with them. And I will go through and work with them one-on-one and give them goals and give them independent writing time as I'm working with the other ones in the very small class of the resource lab. And so we're working more on their actual projects as they're coming up in their other classes. There's no new homework for the labs. The labs are just to help students. The regular writing labs are more to help students with, topical things and practicing the craft of writing, but resource labs are more to help them with their existing writing assignments from other classes.
Okay. I'm glad you brought that up. Those are part of the student support services program that is
Yes.
Being built out and has a lot to offer over and above what's been offered previously. Okay. So yes,
Right.
There's an episode on that. So
I'm very grateful now that whether a student is in, especially if they're in an online class or even in a self-paced plus class where they're working with a teacher, now there's extra resources to say, okay, think you could use some extra help with writing, because it felt like at times there could be frustration on a teacher's part. Like, I know you need extra help, but I only have so much time. And all I can say is work harder. But now I'm glad that you can say, well, we've got this we can help you with, or this we can help you with, or that. So lots of options for a student who, and parents and students who want their children to get more help with something, or need more help to be where they want to be.
yes, for sure. So as we're coming to the end of our conversation here, what final thoughts or recommendations and takeaways would you have for us?
Sometimes MLA is scary, and MLA is Modern Language Association's rules and guidelines for how to cite things within a paper, because of course we want to back up what we're saying with various kinds of support, especially from the text. And so it helps with how to cite that within a paper. And for a long time, Kolbe has used MLA Handbook 8. It has been updated to MLA Handbook 9, which for numerous reasons is somewhat problematic for us Catholics. It's got some language about, updating pronouns. Some of its example sentences are just extra liberal. And so we have not transitioned to MLA 9. However, 2 pieces of exciting news. One, our Kolbe curriculum department has been working on a Kolbe style guide. And so that is practically everything you need to know about MLA anyway, which is fantastic. But then also, since we do live in such an online world, it's so easy to just hop on the internet and look it up real quick. And so the Purdue Online Writing Lab, or the Purdue OWL, is actually a really good resource. We did not recommend it last year because it was being updated to MLA 9 and we weren't sure what was going to happen with the examples and whatnot. They have not adopted the unsavory examples. And so I am 99% sure that we have approved it for continued use. And it is a very good resource. It has MLA, which is what Kolbe uses. It has APA, it has Chicago, it has all the different styles, and it's just very user-friendly. It is also one of the oldest online writing labs around, and so it's very reliable. Some other online resources for MLA are the Guide to Grammar and Writing from the Capital Community College, the Excelsior College OWL, again, online writing lab, and Writing at CSU, Colorado State University. And those are all reputable sites that have been around for a while that use MLA.
All right, that's great. We'll include links to those in our show notes for this episode. Mrs. Dubrosi or Mrs. Hayes, any other takeaways or final thoughts you want to leave with us?
One resource that I recommend to my middle schoolers a lot is Grammarly. There's a paid version, but there's also a free version, and the free version can be useful. It's just a little notch above your average Microsoft Word spell checker. The Grammarly thing will catch bigger errors like run-on sentences. And one of the big things I've noticed that it's good at noticing is verb tenses. So if your verb tenses don't match, if your subjects and verbs don't agree or things like that, it's pretty good at catching those. So if your student especially hasn't done a lot of grammar before, or if they just struggle with that a lot, Grammarly can be really helpful. Even just the free version is really helpful to have on your computer. It just, runs in the background and it'll pop up with little tips as needed. So yeah, so that can be a good tool to use.
Sounds good. I wanted to mention Kolbecast episode 70. It's called First Draft Parent in Service, with some more of our fabulous instructors weighing in on the editing process, and lots of conversation in that area. That's a great companion to this episode. And as I mentioned, episode 164, this is not a Kolbe infomercial. The episode about student support services, I will also include in the show notes. In anticipation of a great school year of writing, I hope these tips that we've discussed today will be helpful to the families who are listening. Mrs. Crawford, Mrs. Dubrosi, and Mrs. Hayes, thanks so much for coming to visit with us. Look forward to talking to you all again real soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, Gloriam.